You reached 92% and then something strange happened. Not collapse. Not failure. Not reversal. Just a quiet stall that made no sense, especially because you did everything that was supposed to work. The practices were consistent. The awareness was refined. The intention was clear. And yet the shift did not complete. This is the point where most people assume something is wrong with them. That assumption is the real illusion. 92% is not almost finished in the way the mind understands progress. It is a threshold state where effort stops working. Up to this point, refinement, discipline, and intentional movement appear to generate results because they dissolve obvious resistance. But past a certain level of coherence, the same strategies begin to interfere. The field no longer responds to trying. It responds to being. This is why the final 8% was never explained. It could not be taught through steps or systems without being distorted. The stall at 92% is not a lack of power. It is a sign of proximity. When consciousness approaches coherence, the remaining distortion is subtle and identity-based rather than behavioral. You are no longer blocked by unconscious patterns. You are held at the edge by identification with progress itself. The one who is still trying to finish the shift becomes the only remaining friction. This is not a mistake. It is a natural checkpoint. Most explanations fail here because they continue to address the viewer as someone who needs to do more. More focus. More healing. More discipline. But the final phase of a quantum shift cannot be entered through accumulation. It occurs through subtraction. Specifically, the release of the identity that believes completion is achieved through effort. That identity worked perfectly until now. It simply does not function past this point. This is why the experience feels confusing. The familiar signals are gone. There is no clear next step, no intuitive pull toward action, no dramatic insight that promises resolution. Instead, there is a strange neutrality. A calm tension. A sense of being right at the edge without knowing what edge that is. This is not stagnation. It is the field waiting for coherence instead of instruction. The final 8% does not respond to strategy because it is not a problem to solve. It is a recognition to allow. Recognition is not mental understanding. It is the moment identity stops leaning forward. When the impulse to finish dissolves, coherence completes itself. This is why forcing at this stage feels exhausting and strangely ineffective. You are no longer misaligned. You are over-involved. You are not behind. You are not blocked. You are not missing anything. You have already moved beyond the phase where effort produces movement. The only thing left is to stop treating completion as something that happens later. The illusion of the 92% plateau is that it looks like delay when it is actually readiness. If you are aligned with this frequency, subscribe and remain within it. Progress slows just before the breakthrough because the system you have been using to measure movement no longer applies. Early stages of change feel dynamic because contrast is obvious. Old patterns fall away, new insights arrive, and the nervous system registers motion. Near completion, contrast diminishes. Coherence increases. And the absence of friction is often misread as stagnation. At advanced levels of alignment, the field no longer responds with dramatic feedback. It responds with neutrality. This is where many misinterpret the signal. Momentum, as the mind understands it, depends on effort producing visible change. But once coherence is high, effort becomes noise. The field is no longer asking for movement. It is checking for stability. Threshold states are disorienting because they strip away familiar reference points. You are no longer clearly misaligned, but you are not yet resting in completion. The sensation is subtle tension without direction. No urgency. No inspiration to push forward. No obvious resistance to overcome. This in-between state often triggers doubt because it feels like something should be happening. That expectation is precisely what creates the illusion of slowdown. Energetically, progress appears to halt because identity has not yet caught up with frequency. The internal state has refined, but the sense of self is still oriented toward becoming rather than being. This creates a mismatch that is not dramatic enough to feel like conflict, yet strong enough to pause external response. The field mirrors this by reducing feedback, not as punishment, but as calibration. This pause is not a block. It is a diagnostic silence. When reality goes quiet, it is not withholding. It is listening. It is waiting to see whether the new state will stabilize without reinforcement. At lower levels, repetition is required to build coherence. At higher levels, repetition signals insecurity. The field responds accordingly. Many people attempt to resolve this by intensifying effort. More focus. More discipline. More seeking. This backfires because it reintroduces identity as a doer trying to cross a finish line. The closer you are to completion, the less tolerance there is for identity-based striving. The system is precise. It does not reward effort once effort is no longer necessary. This is why the slowdown feels personal even though it is structural. The mind assumes that if movement stops, something is wrong. In reality, movement stops because the mechanism has changed. The same input no longer produces output because output is no longer required. The only remaining variable is whether identity will release its orientation toward progress. Breakthroughs do not occur because momentum increases. They occur because momentum is no longer needed. The suddenness people describe is not caused by a final push, but by the absence of one. When identity stops leaning forward, coherence locks in. The field responds instantly because there is nothing left to resolve. The pause before completion is not resistance. It is not delay. It is not a test. It is the system confirming whether the state is real without effort. When that confirmation is complete, movement resumes, not gradually, but all at once. The assumption that the final 8% requires more work is the last illusion to dissolve. It feels logical. If progress slows, the instinct is to increase input. More focus. More refinement. More discipline. This logic worked earlier, so the mind applies it again. But the reason it no longer works is not because you are doing it wrong. It is because the function of effort has expired. Up to a certain point, action clears density. It brings unconscious material into awareness and organizes the system. But once coherence is high, additional action does not add clarity. It adds signal. At this level, signal becomes interference. The field is no longer responding to what you do. It is responding to what you assume yourself to be while doing it. The final phase of a quantum shift cannot be completed by fixing anything because nothing is broken. It cannot be completed by healing because there is no wound left to address. It cannot be completed by discipline because discipline implies control, and control implies separation. The remaining 8% is not an absence of capacity. It is the presence of an outdated orientation. What remains at this stage is subtle. It is the identity of the one who is still improving. Still refining. Still reaching for a future state where completion finally arrives. This identity is not wrong. It carried you this far. But it cannot cross the threshold it was designed to approach. The closer you get to coherence, the more this identity becomes friction rather than momentum. This is why adding effort now feels heavy instead of empowering. There is no inspiration behind it. No resonance. Just obligation. The system is signaling that the mode of operation must change. Not dramatically. Quietly. The shift does not require a new method. It requires the absence of method. This is where recognition begins to appear, not as a technique, but as a subtle relaxation. Recognition is not an action. It is the moment you stop assuming something needs to be done. It is the internal acknowledgement that the state you were trying to reach is already present without reinforcement. This is not passive. It is precise. Striving carries a frequency of incompletion. Recognition carries a frequency of stability. The field responds differently to each. When you strive, reality mirrors delay. When you recognize, reality mirrors confirmation. This is why the final phase often completes suddenly and without drama. Nothing new is added. Something old is released. It is important to understand that this is not about doing less in a performative way. It is about no longer orienting yourself around improvement. The effort to stop effort is still effort. The shift happens when effort naturally falls away because it is no longer needed. This cannot be forced. It can only be noticed. The missing 8% was never more work. It was the absence of the belief that work was still required. When that belief dissolves, coherence locks in. Not because you made it happen, but because nothing was preventing it anymore. Before the final 8% can resolve, one foundational truth has to be seen clearly, not intellectually but experientially. Reality does not rearrange itself in response to what you want. It does not move because of intention, affirmation, or desire. It reorganizes only in response to the state you are inhabiting while wanting. This distinction is subtle, and missing it is what keeps the last phase suspended. Desire points forward. State is what you are standing in now. The field does not read direction. It reads condition. When consciousness is coherent, reality reflects coherence. When consciousness is subtly tense, reality mirrors hesitation. At 92%, most people are no longer overtly misaligned, but they are still leaning forward internally. That lean is quiet, almost invisible, yet it is enough to stall reflection. The mirror of reality is precise. It does not respond to the words you say or the goals you hold. It responds to the emotional posture underneath them. You can desire abundance while inhabiting vigilance. You can intend connection while holding subtle self-protection. The mirror reflects the posture, not the narrative. This is why effort-driven intention works early and fails later. Early on, posture shifts quickly. Later, posture is refined, and even small contractions matter. At the 92% threshold, contraction is no longer emotional turbulence or fear. It is often something socially praised, like focus, responsibility, or commitment to growth. These states feel elevated, but they still contain tension. They imply that something is not yet settled. The field reads this and responds accurately by keeping external conditions in a state of near completion. This is not punishment. It is fidelity. Reality is not withholding results. It is mirroring exactly what is present. When inner state says almost, reality reflects almost. When inner state says not yet, reality responds with delay. When inner state stabilizes into enough, reality reorganizes without resistance. This is why pushing harder produces diminishing returns. Action layered on top of subtle contraction amplifies the signal of incompletion. The mirror becomes sharper, not more forgiving. At this level, the system is no longer teaching through contrast. It is confirming through stillness. The absence of movement is feedback, not obstruction. The shift required here is not to want less, but to want from a different place. Desire that arises from sufficiency carries no tension. Desire that arises from lack always does. The field does not differentiate between big and small desires. It differentiates between stable and unstable states. Once stability is present, desire no longer distorts reflection. Notice how reality behaves when you are internally settled. There is less urgency. Less interpretation. Less mental commentary. Things move without effort because nothing is asking them to prove anything. This is the state the mirror completes around. Not excitement. Not striving. Calm sufficiency. Like the video now as a confirmation that this recognition has landed. The final 8% does not require you to want differently. It requires you to be differently while wanting. When the inner state no longer leans forward, the mirror has nothing left to delay. Emotion is not a reaction to reality. It is the instruction reality responds to. Before words, before thoughts, before intention fully forms, emotion broadcasts a condition. The field does not interpret meaning. It reads frequency. Emotion is that frequency in motion. At early stages of change, emotions are obvious. Fear, excitement, doubt, hope. As alignment deepens, emotions refine. They become quieter, more complex, and easier to mislabel as neutral or even positive. This is where many misunderstand why completion stalls. The emotional signal is still active, but it is subtle enough to pass unnoticed. Anticipation is a common example. It feels light, optimistic, forward-looking. But anticipation contains a message, not now. It projects fulfillment into the future, even when the future feels close. The field responds faithfully by keeping fulfillment just ahead. Not out of denial, but out of precision. The signal was clear. Vigilance is another refined state. It often disguises itself as awareness or responsibility. Internally, it feels like staying alert, staying aligned, staying on top of things. Energetically, it signals that something might slip if attention relaxes. The field mirrors this by keeping conditions slightly unresolved, requiring continued monitoring. Even enthusiasm can carry distortion at this level. When enthusiasm is driven by eagerness to arrive, it still implies absence. The emotion may feel elevated, but its instruction is incomplete. The field does not reward tone. It responds to content. This is why clear intention is not enough. Intention is directional. Emotion is positional. You can intend completion while emotionally inhabiting almost. The field follows the position, not the direction. It reflects where you are standing, not where you are pointing. At 92%, emotional misalignment is rarely dramatic. It is not anxiety or fear. It is often a faint pressure to maintain momentum, to ensure nothing is missed, to keep the process active. These emotions are socially validated and spiritually encouraged, which makes them harder to release. Yet they still instruct the field to wait. The field is neutral. It does not evaluate whether an emotion is justified or productive. It simply mirrors it. When the emotional signal stabilizes into sufficiency, reflection accelerates. When the emotional signal fluctuates between readiness and anticipation, reflection pauses. This is not about suppressing emotion or trying to feel calm. That would be another form of control. It is about noticing what is already present without attempting to modify it. When emotion is seen clearly, without resistance or use, it settles on its own. The instruction changes naturally. The most coherent emotional state is not excitement or certainty. It is quiet neutrality with no internal argument. A state where nothing is being rehearsed, managed, or projected. In that state, emotion carries no forward pull. It is complete where it is. When emotion no longer leans into the future, the field receives a stable signal. There is no longer an instruction to delay. The mirror responds without effort because nothing is distorting the reflection. The final 8% resolves when emotion stops asking reality to arrive somewhere else. When emotion rests fully here, reality has no choice but to follow. Control becomes disruptive precisely when alignment is high. Earlier in the process, control appears useful because it organizes chaos. It directs attention, builds habits, and stabilizes intention. But once coherence is established, control stops organizing and starts fragmenting. At this stage, even refined control introduces separation where unity is required. Microcontrol is especially deceptive because it feels responsible. It shows up as constant self-monitoring, subtle correction, and the impulse to fine-tune what is already functioning. Internally, it sounds like staying on track or making sure nothing slips. Energetically, it communicates mistrust. Not of reality, but of the state itself. The field receives this as instability and mirrors it by withholding completion. Spiritualized effort is control wearing sacred language. It disguises itself as devotion, discipline, or commitment to growth. It insists that awareness must be maintained, posture corrected, frequency managed. While these practices can be useful earlier, at this threshold they fracture coherence. They split the system into an observer and something being managed. Wholeness cannot emerge from division. Coherence is not precision. It is consistency. Precision focuses on parts. Coherence rests in the whole. When attention keeps adjusting components, the system never settles. The field does not respond to how accurately you manage yourself. It responds to whether you are internally unified. This is why techniques stop working here. Not because they are ineffective, but because they imply that something is still wrong. Each technique carries an assumption of incompletion. The field does not argue with that assumption. It reflects it. The more refined the technique, the subtler the signal of lack, and the sharper the stall. Wholeness requires trust. Not blind trust, but experiential trust that nothing needs to be adjusted for the state to hold. When control relaxes, coherence is allowed to stabilize on its own. This feels uncomfortable at first because identity has been structured around management. Letting go of control can feel like neglect, even when nothing deteriorates. Internal consistency matters more than optimization now. Consistency means there is no internal argument. No part pushing forward while another watches. No effort to maintain a state. Just presence without supervision. This is not collapse. It is integration. Control always looks forward. It anticipates deviation and corrects before it occurs. Coherence exists only now. When attention is anchored in now without corrective impulse, the system becomes self-stabilizing. The field responds immediately to this because there is no conflicting instruction. This does not mean abandoning awareness. Awareness without control is simply observation without agenda. It does not interfere. It does not adjust. It witnesses. In that witnessing, the system settles into its natural configuration. The final 8% does not complete because you manage yourself better. It completes because management is no longer necessary. When internal governance dissolves into internal agreement, coherence locks in. Comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this timeline. Control was never wrong. It was just temporary. When it steps aside, what remains is already whole. Allowing is often misunderstood because it is described as a pause in movement rather than a shift in state. This misunderstanding keeps many people suspended just outside completion. Allowing is not waiting for something to happen. It is the condition where nothing needs to happen in order for the state to be valid. It is not a gap. It is a stabilization. Waiting implies time. Allowing is outside of time. Waiting carries expectation. Allowing carries certainty without demand. When you wait, there is an internal posture leaning forward, even if it is quiet. When you allow, that lean dissolves. The system stops bracing for arrival because it is no longer oriented toward arrival at all. This is where surrender is often confused with passivity. Passivity is disengagement. It withdraws presence and collapses authority. Surrender, in contrast, is full presence without interference. It does not abdicate power. It releases the need to apply it. There is a profound difference. Passivity says, "Nothing I do matters." Allowing says, "Nothing needs to be done." Authority without force is one of the most coherent states consciousness can occupy. It is the state where you are not managing outcomes, yet outcomes reorganize around you. This does not happen because you stopped caring. It happens because care is no longer mixed with control. The signal becomes clean. Allowing does not mean abandoning discernment or awareness. It means awareness no longer has an agenda. It sees clearly without attempting to steer. This is why allowing feels unfamiliar at first. Identity has been built around adjustment, correction, and movement. When those functions fall quiet, the mind interprets it as loss. In reality, it is consolidation. The impulse to do something is strongest right before allowing becomes available. This is not coincidence. It is the final reflex of an identity that equates movement with validity. When that reflex is not followed, nothing collapses. In fact, everything becomes more stable. The system learns that it does not need constant input to remain aligned. Allowing is active because it requires presence without manipulation. It is easier to act than to remain still without drifting. It is easier to correct than to trust coherence. This is why allowing is not a retreat. It is a mastery. When allowing is present, there is no internal negotiation. No part pushing forward. No part holding back. There is agreement. This agreement is what the field recognizes as readiness. Not readiness to receive, but readiness to remain. Nothing is being invited. Nothing is being chased. The state stands on its own. From that position, reality has no conflicting instruction. It no longer receives signals of anticipation, vigilance, or adjustment. It receives stability. This is why allowing completes what effort cannot. Effort always contains direction. Allowing contains grounding. Direction creates movement. Grounding creates manifestation. The final 8% does not ask you to stop caring. It asks you to stop leaning. When leaning ends, allowing becomes natural. And when allowing is natural, completion is no longer delayed because there is nothing left to resolve. Creation does not occur over time. It occurs in the present, or it does not occur at all. This is not a philosophical idea. It is a functional mechanism. The field cannot respond to future states because future states do not exist as conditions. They exist only as projections. Power dissolves the moment consciousness leans forward. Future orientation feels productive because it carries intention. It feels like movement. But intention aimed at later subtly withdraws presence from now. The system reads that withdrawal as instability. The instruction becomes unclear. The field cannot organize around a state that is not fully inhabited. At earlier stages, future focus seems effective because it motivates action. Action produces contrast, and contrast produces feedback. But once coherence is high, action is no longer the primary variable. State is. And state only exists now. The moment attention leaves now, even slightly, the state fragments. This is why the final 8% cannot arrive later. Later is not a location the field can access. There is no future version of you to deliver completion to. There is only the current configuration of consciousness. If completion is not recognized here, it cannot be installed elsewhere. Recognition is immediate or it does not happen. This is why the last phase often feels sudden. It is not built gradually. It is noticed. The moment the present is fully occupied without reference to what comes next, the system stabilizes. The field responds instantly because there is no temporal distortion in the signal. Future orientation always contains a question. When will this complete? How will it happen? What will it look like? These questions may be quiet, but they are active. They pull attention forward. The field mirrors questions with delay. It mirrors answers with confirmation. Presence is not concentration. It is not effort. It is the absence of mental relocation. When attention stops rehearsing outcomes, the system becomes available. Nothing is being postponed. Nothing is being prepared for. This is when creation locks in. The mind resists this because it equates immediacy with risk. If nothing is anticipated, how will things work? But anticipation is not intelligence. It is habit. Intelligence is responsive, not predictive. It moves with what is, not with what might be. At the threshold, the most powerful shift is simple and uncomfortable. Stop referencing later. Stop measuring progress. Stop asking how close you are. These actions are not neutral. They pull you out of the only point where completion can occur. The present moment is not a slice of time. It is a state of occupancy. When you are fully here, without leaning forward or bracing backward, the system becomes coherent. There is no split between now and next. The field receives a single, stable signal. The final 8% is not waiting for you in the future. It is waiting for you to stop leaving the present. The moment you are fully here without agenda, recognition happens on its own. Creation does not arrive. It reveals itself the instant nothing delays it. Struggle was never a sign that something went wrong. It was the mechanism that refined alignment. Contrast is how clarity sharpens itself. Without it, frequency remains vague. With it, coherence becomes precise. The frustration you felt near completion was not delay. It was calibration. Early contrast is loud. It arrives as conflict, resistance, and obvious misalignment. Later contrast is subtle. It appears as near misses, almosts, and the strange feeling of being close without crossing. This kind of contrast is often misinterpreted as error because it lacks drama. But its function is exact. It removes what no longer belongs. Every moment of near completion exposed something small that could not travel forward. A lingering attachment to outcome. A quiet expectation. A reflex to measure progress. These were not mistakes. They were refinements. Contrast did not punish you. It clarified you. The mind tends to narrate contrast as delay because it assumes linear movement. But refinement is not linear. It is subtractive. Each friction point was not a setback. It was a filter. Each moment of frustration revealed where identity still leaned. Without those moments, the final alignment would have been unstable. Contrast does not create misalignment. It reveals it. When something feels difficult, it is because two frequencies are meeting that cannot coexist. The tension is not resistance. It is incompatibility resolving itself. Once resolved, the tension disappears without effort. Near completion frustration is especially misunderstood because it feels unfair. You did the work. You refined the state. You reached coherence. And still, something did not move. This experience tempts the mind to doubt the process. In reality, it confirms its accuracy. The system did not allow a partial alignment to pass as complete. Trust erodes only when contrast is interpreted personally. When frustration is framed as failure, confidence collapses. When it is seen as refinement, trust deepens. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was excessive. Every edge you encountered was necessary to remove distortion. Contrast also trained neutrality. Each time something almost happened, anticipation lost power. Each time effort did not produce movement, control weakened. Each time you reached clarity without completion, identity softened. This was not delay. It was preparation without instruction. There is no alternate path where this refinement could have been skipped. Stability requires precision. Precision requires contrast. The final state is not fragile because it has been tested repeatedly. It does not wobble because everything that could wobble has already been removed. When you see contrast clearly, blame dissolves. There is no self to accuse and no process to doubt. There is only recognition that alignment is exact, not generous. It does not reward effort. It confirms coherence. The frustration you felt was the last resistance leaving. Not resistance you needed to overcome, but resistance that needed to exhaust itself. Once it did, nothing remained to interfere. Contrast did not delay the quantum shift. It completed it quietly, piece by piece, until nothing misaligned remained. When trust returns, movement becomes unnecessary. And when movement stops, what has already been aligned reveals itself as complete. Timelines are not paths you move along. They are states that respond to what you are being. This distinction matters because movement implies effort, direction, and time. Responsiveness implies resonance. Reality does not wait for you to arrive somewhere. It organizes itself around the identity you are occupying now. A timeline is not chosen consciously. It is selected automatically through identity. Identity is not your personality or your story. It is the internal reference point you assume as normal. What feels like me? What feels stable? What feels unquestioned? The field treats this reference point as instruction and assembles conditions that match it. When identity is oriented toward becoming, timelines reflect process. There is always another step, another refinement, another phase before resolution. This does not feel wrong because becoming is rewarded early. It produces growth, insight, and visible change. But at advanced stages, becoming becomes delay. The identity of the one who is almost there keeps selecting almost there timelines. This is not because the field misunderstands you. It is because it understands you precisely. If identity says, "I am evolving toward completion," reality responds with scenarios that validate evolution without finality. If identity says, "I am stabilizing into what is already complete," reality reorganizes to match that assumption. This is why timelines shift without effort when identity shifts. There is no negotiation. No recalibration period. No proof required. Identity is treated as fact. The field does not test it. It reflects it. Identifying as becoming carries subtle tension. There is forward momentum, but no rest. Even when progress feels good, there is an underlying sense that something is pending. This pending quality becomes the anchor point. Timelines selected from this anchor cannot resolve because resolution would contradict identity. Identity does not need to be affirmed or declared to operate. It operates silently. It is revealed through posture, expectation, and what feels permissible. If completion feels premature or undeserved, identity is still oriented toward becoming. If rest feels unsafe, identity is still oriented toward process. Timelines collapse and reorganize the moment identity stabilizes. Stabilization does not mean certainty or confidence. It means the absence of internal argument. There is no part pushing forward and no part holding back. The state is no longer provisional. This is why the final 8% does not respond to motivation. Motivation belongs to becoming. Identity stabilization belongs to being. When identity stops referencing who you are turning into and rests in who you are, timelines adjust instantly. You do not move into a new timeline by deciding to. You notice you are already in it when identity changes. The shift feels sudden because it was never gradual. It was simply unrecognized. Becoming was necessary. It refined you. It prepared the system. But it cannot complete itself. Completion occurs when becoming is no longer needed as an identity. The moment you stop asking who you are becoming, reality stops asking you to keep moving. The timeline resolves not because you reached it, but because you stopped selecting the one that required distance. Identity chooses. Reality follows. There is no lag. Only recognition. Reality does not move first. Identity does. This reverses the way causality is usually understood. Most people believe conditions change and then self-concept adjusts. In truth, the sequence is the opposite. Identity stabilizes, and reality reorganizes to match it. Until that stabilization occurs, external movement remains conditional. Identity stabilization is not a declaration. It is not confidence or bravado. It is the absence of internal negotiation. When there is no part of you waiting to see what happens next before settling, identity has stabilized. The field responds immediately to this because there is no contradictory signal to interpret. Waiting for evidence delays resolution because waiting implies doubt. Doubt does not need to be emotional or dramatic to be effective. It can be quiet, polite, reasonable. It can sound like, "Let me just see one sign." But even that slight conditional posture instructs reality to remain provisional. The field mirrors the hesitation exactly. This is why evidence never arrives first at this level. Evidence follows stabilization. When identity says, "I will settle once I see it," reality says, "I will show it once you settle." Neither is wrong. The loop continues until one side stops waiting. Only identity can do that. Internal certainty is often misunderstood as belief. Belief is mental. Certainty is structural. It is not something you feel. It is something you stop questioning. You know identity has stabilized when you no longer check whether it is working. There is no scanning. No monitoring. No comparison. The state stands without defense. External change appears sudden because it was not built through accumulation. It was released through coherence. Once identity stabilizes, the field no longer has multiple instructions to reconcile. It receives a single, consistent signal. Organization becomes effortless. This is why affirmations lose power here. Affirmations are attempts to convince identity. But identity at this level does not respond to persuasion. It responds to resolution. When the question disappears, the answer appears without delay. The reversal of causality can feel uncomfortable because it removes leverage. There is nothing to do to make reality comply. Compliance is automatic once the internal condition is set. The only work, if it can be called that, is noticing whether identity is still referencing proof. Proof-seeking is subtle. It can hide in curiosity. In checking timelines. In comparing outcomes. Each check reintroduces instability. Not enough to collapse progress, but enough to keep it suspended. When identity stabilizes, attention relaxes. There is no urgency to confirm anything. This relaxation is not indifference. It is completeness. Nothing is being waited on, so nothing is delayed. Reality follows this completeness precisely. Opportunities align. Conditions shift. Not as rewards, but as reflections. There is no celebration required because nothing feels achieved. It simply feels consistent. The moment identity stops looking outward to decide who it is, the outside has no choice but to agree. This is the point where movement resumes, not gradually, but cleanly. Causality was never broken. It was misunderstood. Identity leads. Reality confirms. When the lead is steady, the confirmation is immediate. The final 8% does not complete gradually because it was never a process. Everything that could be refined was already refined before this point. What remains is not something to build, but something to release. When release occurs, it happens instantly. Nonlinear completion feels sudden because nothing is added at the end. There is no final step, no cumulative effort that tips the scale. The system does not cross a finish line. It collapses into coherence. Collapse is not destruction. It is resolution. Multiple signals reduce into one. Up to this point, the system tolerated partial alignment. It allowed mixed instructions. Identity could lean forward while state stabilized. Emotion could anticipate while presence deepened. Reality reflected this with near completion. Once coherence reaches a certain threshold, partial signals are no longer sustainable. The system either stabilizes fully or resets. There is no middle ground. Collapse dynamics occur when internal contradiction disappears. Not when effort peaks, but when effort becomes irrelevant. The moment identity stops referencing what is missing, the structure reorganizes. This reorganization is immediate because the field was already holding the configuration in readiness. Nothing new needs to be created. It simply locks in. This is why the final phase feels irreversible. Once coherence stabilizes, there is no reason for the system to fragment again. Fragmentation only occurs when identity splits attention. When attention is unified, reversal has no mechanism. The state is self-sustaining. Many expect the final phase to feel dramatic, emotional, triumphant. Instead, it often feels quiet, almost anticlimactic. This is because resolution does not require confirmation. When contradiction ends, silence follows. The system rests. The suddenness can be unsettling to the mind because it contradicts effort-based logic. If nothing was done, how could something complete? But the assumption that completion must be earned is part of the identity that collapses. When that identity dissolves, the question dissolves with it. Nonlinear resolution also explains why repetition cannot force completion. Repeating practices, affirmations, or corrections does not accelerate collapse. It delays it by keeping the system active. Collapse requires stillness. Not passive stillness, but undisturbed coherence. Once coherence is reached, the field no longer negotiates. There is no gradual adjustment period. External reality reorganizes quickly because it is no longer reconciling conflicting signals. The reflection becomes clean. This is why people often describe the final shift as obvious in hindsight. Looking back, it seems inevitable. Of course it happened. Everything was already aligned. The only thing missing was the end of interference. Irreversibility does not mean perfection. It means stability. Challenges may still arise, but they no longer threaten the state. They are contextual, not identity-based. The system does not regress because there is nothing to regress to. The final 8% happens all at once because it is not a journey. It is a recognition point. When coherence is complete, reality has no delay mechanism left. The shift does not arrive. It reveals itself the moment nothing contradicts it. Before the idea of completion can fully settle, one final assumption must dissolve. The assumption that you were the one shifting. That there was a separate individual moving through states, climbing levels, approaching something called alignment. This assumption was useful. It organized experience. But it was never accurate. You were never the mover. You were the field in which movement appeared. Consciousness itself does not change. It does not evolve, improve, or arrive anywhere. What changes is perception within consciousness. What shifts is identification. The sense of being a doer navigating reality is one of those perceptual layers. The seeker identity forms early because it gives orientation. It provides direction, motivation, and meaning. It asks questions. It pursues clarity. It refines states. And it is effective, up to a point. But it is still an identity within consciousness, not consciousness itself. When the seeker approaches completion, it quietly becomes the last veil. The idea that you were shifting implies effort over time. It implies progress from lesser to greater. Consciousness does not operate this way. Consciousness is constant. It does not improve its capacity to be aware. It simply becomes aware of itself through different lenses. A quantum shift is not consciousness changing. It is consciousness recognizing itself without distortion. This is why the final phase often feels like a letting go rather than an achievement. There is no sense of having done something extraordinary. There is a sense of something obvious being noticed. The one who is trying to shift relaxes because it is no longer needed to explain experience. The doer identity dissolves not because it was wrong, but because it is no longer useful. It served its function. It brought attention to refinement. Once refinement is complete, the doer has nothing left to manage. When management ends, presence remains. Shifts feel dramatic only when viewed from within identity. From consciousness, nothing has changed. The same awareness that observed confusion now observes clarity. The same field that held effort now holds ease. There was no journey from one to the other. Only a change in what was being identified with. This recognition is stabilizing because it removes pressure. There is no longer a responsibility to maintain a state. Consciousness does not require maintenance. States arise and dissolve within it naturally. When identity stops clinging to state, coherence sustains itself. The sense of being behind, ahead, or almost there loses relevance here. Consciousness is not on a timeline. It is present before, during, and after every experience. When this is seen, the entire narrative of shifting collapses into simplicity. You did not reach completion. Completion revealed itself when the idea of reaching was no longer needed. The one who thought they were shifting steps aside, not dramatically, but quietly. What remains is awareness without agenda. Presence without direction. Consciousness recognizing itself as the constant that was never incomplete. This is not an ending. It is the absence of needing one. Recognition is not an action you perform. It is the absence of the need to perform. This is why it succeeds where effort could not. Effort always implies distance between where you are and where you think you should be. Recognition collapses that distance instantly by revealing there was never a gap to cross. Effort refines. It clarifies. It prepares. But it cannot complete. Completion requires finality, and effort cannot provide finality because it feeds on continuation. As long as something is being done to reach a state, the state is assumed to be absent. The field reflects that assumption faithfully. Recognition does not attempt to change the state. It notices that the state is already present without reinforcement. This noticing is not mental. It is structural. It changes the way identity rests. The system stops bracing. The field receives a stable signal for the first time. Calm authority emerges naturally from recognition. Not the authority of control or dominance, but the authority of sufficiency. There is nothing to prove and nothing to correct. When authority is calm, it does not push. It does not seek confirmation. It stands. This standing is what effort was trying to achieve indirectly. Effort hoped that enough action would eventually create certainty. Recognition begins with certainty and requires no action to sustain it. This is why recognition feels quiet. It has no momentum because it does not need any. The end of seeking is not a dramatic decision. It is the moment seeking no longer makes sense. When recognition lands, the impulse to look for the next insight dissolves. Not out of resignation, but out of completion. There is no tension driving movement. This does not mean curiosity ends or growth stops. It means growth is no longer tied to identity. Experience continues to unfold, but it is no longer used to define self. The system remains flexible without being unstable. Recognition also removes the need for validation. When something is recognized, it does not require repetition to stay real. You do not need to remind yourself of it. You do not need to defend it. It is simply how things are now. Effort was never wrong. It was contextually appropriate. It refined the signal until recognition became possible. Once recognition occurs, effort naturally falls away because it has nothing left to refine. This is why the final 8% could not be forced. Force implies uncertainty. Recognition implies completion. The two cannot coexist. The moment recognition stabilizes, force becomes unnecessary and disappears on its own. There is no technique for recognition. Techniques operate on the assumption of absence. Recognition reveals presence. It cannot be applied. It can only be allowed to register. When recognition completes what effort could not, there is no sense of accomplishment. There is relief. The system relaxes into itself. Nothing has been achieved. Something has been acknowledged. This acknowledgement is the final mechanism. Not because it does something, but because it ends the need for anything to be done. Completion is not an event. It is the quiet authority of knowing there is nowhere else to go. Nothing was ever missing. There was no lost piece, no withheld component, no final element waiting to be earned. The sense of incompletion was not pointing to absence. It was pointing to misidentification. Something was being looked for that was already present, simply not recognized as sufficient. The idea of an 8% gap was a useful lens while refinement was still unfolding. It gave language to the feeling of almost. But at the end, that language dissolves. There is no percentage left to integrate. There is only the realization that the measurement itself no longer applies. What felt unfinished was not the state. It was the perspective observing the state. Identity was still oriented toward resolution, so experience mirrored resolution in progress. When that orientation relaxed, nothing needed to change for completion to be obvious. The system was already whole. This is why the ending does not feel like arrival. There is no crossing over. No dramatic shift in circumstances required to validate what has already stabilized. The quiet certainty that remains does not ask to be confirmed. It does not seek reinforcement. It rests. Misidentification creates movement. Recognition creates stillness. When you believed something was missing, attention leaned forward. When that belief dissolved, attention returned to itself. In that return, the idea of missing lost coherence. It could no longer be sustained. The final resolution is not conceptual. It is felt as absence of tension. No internal pressure to improve. No scanning for signs. No sense of waiting. Experience continues, but without commentary about where it should be going. The field reflects this immediately because there is nothing left to reflect back as unresolved. Nothing new needs to be understood here. Understanding was never the obstacle. The only thing that needed to end was the assumption that something needed to end. When that assumption falls away, the loop closes naturally. Certainty at this level is not confidence. It is simplicity. There is no emotional charge around it. No excitement. No disappointment. Just clarity. The kind that does not argue with itself. The journey language dissolves now because there is no longer a journey being referenced. What remains does not feel advanced or elevated. It feels ordinary and complete. Presence without agenda. Awareness without direction. This is why the final 8% was never explained. Explanation would have reinforced the idea that something was missing. Silence was more accurate. Only recognition could complete what explanation could not. Nothing has been achieved. Nothing has been fixed. Nothing has been added. Something false has been released, and in its absence, what was always here stands unobstructed. There is nowhere else this needs to go. No next phase implied. No future resolution required. The arc closes not with instruction, but with certainty. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes.